Right. So next, I'm very happy to introduce my colleague, Pavel Reichl, who is currently a research fellow here at KU Leuven, working on a project on early post-Kantian historiography of philosophy. His research and philosophical interests are in the history of modern philosophy, especially Kant, German idealism, phenomenology, and Latin American philosophy. And again, I'll mention two recent publications. First, Kant's response to Hume on natural theology, dogmatic anthropomorphism, analogical inference, and symbolic representation, which has just come out this year in the Journal of the History of Philosophy. And making history philosophical, Kant, Maimon, and the evolution of the historiography of philosophy in the critical period, which came out in the British Journal of the History of Philosophy in 2020. And the title of his talk today is Leopoldo and Postcolonial Appropriations of Hegel's Master-Slave Dialectic.
Thanks very much for that, Steve. So I'm going to share Okay, so the title is, as mentioned, Leopoldo and Postcolonial Readings of the Master-Slave Dialectic. The subtitle is Variations on a Theme. So after hearing about Fichte and Zea, naturally, I moved to Hegel and Zea. So when I figure out how to change this slide. Okay, so I deleted the introduction to Zea because we have grounding in Zea. So I will just say that I'm going to look at his later work, specifically on a book from 1978 entitled La Filosofía de la Historia Americana, the Philosophy of American History. So there's 2 points about the title that I'm saying, about the content, which is later confirmed when looking at the content. So the first is, and I think it's already mentioned by Gesa, it's Hegelian in nature, his account of, or his philosophy of history is Hegelian in spirit and method, and he aims to extend and apply the Hegelian framework for the philosophy of history. However, this is the second point, it's not a philosophy of universal or European history, but American history. So we've heard there are problems with Hegel's philosophy of history, there are gaps. One such gap is that Hegel locates Latin America outside of history, and because history is rational, it's located outside of reason. So this there's account attempts to supplement the Hegelian account with an account of what he calls history in Latin American consciousness, which begins from Spanish colonization of the Americas through to the liberation with Bolivar. And that's the second mention of Bolivar in a row. So it's not only about adding more to the story, but of reinterpreting the Hegelian account of philosophy of history from the perspective of Latin American consciousness, from the perspective of the margins or the periphery. And because for Hegel, Latin America is located outside of history, it's an account that is written outside, from the perspective of outside of history, as Zea emphasized. Okay, so despite the fact that he draws very heavily on Hegel, this particular idiosyncrasy to his appropriation of Hegel, to his reading of Hegel, and that's that he reduces the entire Hegelian philosophy of history to a short section of the phenomenology of spirit, the master-slave dialectic. So he completely ignores the lectures on the philosophy of history, ignores the philosophy of Reich, ignores the rest of the phenomenology, and only focuses on these few stages. It's somewhat of a mystery why in the scholarship. So, for example, Carlos Sanchez writes, quote, the reason as to why Zea narrows his focus in such a way is not documented. However, one thing we do know is that Hegel's phenomenology of spirit was very popular among the young intelligentsia in Mexico and Latin America in general. So we can add to that perhaps the publication or the Spanish translation and publication of Roget's lectures on Hegel a few years before this work, I think in 1971. And certainly Hegel's phenomenology and master-slave dialectic was discussed in Latin America as in Europe. But I want to really sort of ask if there are philosophical or systemic reasons for why Zea would focus on the master-slave dialectic. So this is actually a variation of a more specific and less ambitious variation of Louis's question. So why post-colonial thinkers draw on German idealism? So this is why Leopoldo draws on the massive slave dialectic specifically. Okay. So one obvious reason why he might draw on the massive slave dialectic is because he's dealing with the colonial context, and as we see from other post-colonial readings of the massive slave dialectic, and as Sanchez himself later cites as a second and more important reason for Zea's engagement with it, he says, quote, the master slave dialectic lends itself as an analytical tool to investigate relations of oppression between the old world and new. So this would line up there with other post-colonial readings such as Fanon's, which see a kind of structural analogy between the dependence relations between master and slave and the dependence relations between colonizer and colonized. So hence, Sanchez continues, Zea, quote, substitutes Hegel's abstract master and abstract slave to concrete Europeans and concrete indigenous others. So master supposed to represent European colonizer, slave is supposed to stand in or represent the indigenous colonized. There's some consensus on this literature because probably the only other article on this topic from Olivia Schutte makes the same claim. So she writes, quote, the master-slave dialectic is understood by Zea as the struggle for freedom and autonomy waged by the slave, in this case, the dependent Latin American consciousness against the master, the European conquering consciousness. Okay, so in what follows, I want to pour a bit of cold water on this assumption that there is easy, seamless fit between the master-slave dialectic and the colonial situation, specifically the relation of colonizer and colonized. I want to problematize this fit a little bit, and then in the subsequent section, I'll turn to Zea and discuss how he navigates some of these problems that I will raise. So the master-slave dialectic, in terms of the basic narrative, it's clear enough. Two individuals encounter one another, they try to kill each other, and as a result of the battle, one becomes master, the other becomes slave, and this relation is ultimately reversed. For my purposes, I want to focus on two constitutive features of the master-slave dialectic. Constitutive in the sense that without these features, there would be no master and slave and no master-slave dialectic. So the first is that in the two individuals that encounter one another, there's a mutual demand for recognition. Mutual in the sense that each demands recognition from the other, or each requires or needs recognition from the other. As Hegel puts this in the phenomenology, it says each individual must elevate its self-certainty of existing for itself to truth, both in the other and in itself. So the thought is, I need confirmation that I'm a free and independent being, and I need that confirmation from another free and independent being. So I not only need to confirm that I'm free and independent, but at the same time, I need to confirm that the other who is confirming my freedom and independence is like me, free and independent. So as Hegel puts it somewhat laconically elsewhere, what one consciousness knows does, the other does as well. So this is why you need both. This is why you have a life and death struggle. So I think as Robert Stern points out, if I just need proof for myself that I'm independent, that I'm not dependent on nature, on biological life, I can play Russian roulette or go bungee jumping. But I also need proof that the other is free and independent, and hence you have a life and death struggle rather than just a game of Russian roulette. Second point is that this encounter happens in a state of nature. This is something that Hegel makes clear in the phenomena, in the lecture, sorry, in the encyclopedia, not in the phenomenology. So he writes there, the fight for recognition in the extreme form here indicated can only occur in the state of nature, where men live only as individuals. By contrast, it is absent from civil society and the political states because recognition is already present there. So the thought is, this demand for recognition has to be immediate. I immediately demand recognition from the other. It's not mediated by social forms. Because it is mediated by social forms, there won't be a need to try to kill the other. You can simply, I don't know, buy a nicer car if you want recognition or whatever the social form is. Here, you go immediately for the other's throat. You try to extract recognition by force directly and immediately from the other. So it's these two ingredients that reach the life and death struggle, and ultimately to the emergence of the master and slave, because the master and slave are simply defined in terms of how they emerge from the life and death struggle. So in some, this is probably going to be a controversial point based on conversations in the last few days, but so to put it differently, what is required for there to be a life and death struggle, and hence for the roles of master and slave to become established, are two individuals, each who has a certain attitude, an immediate demand for recognition in a certain state of nature, not mediated by social rule. Then and only then is there a life in that struggle and an emergence of these two roles. Okay. So if these two conditions are missing, there is no life and death struggle, and hence no master slave. And now I just want to briefly show that in the colonial situation, these two elements are in fact missing. So it doesn't seem like there's a mutual demand for recognition in the colonial situation. Colonizer arrives, does not demand recognition from the colonized. They demand recognition of their political authority, but not for their status as free and independent beings. And if they do demand such recognition, their self-conception as free and independent beings does not depend on. It's a point that Fanon makes. He says here in the colonial situation, the master laughs at the consciousness of the slave. What he wants from the slave is not recognition, but work. Secondly, the encounter happens in a social context. So all forms of misrecognition are mediated through social norms. This is something that Fanon doesn't explicitly say, but he talks about how the colonizer imposes their norms related to beauty and language onto the colonized. So whatever imbalance or dependence relations result are mediated through such norms. We see in this picture of the meeting between Cortes and Moctezuma that the meeting is actually socially mediated, very stylized, so they're not immediately at one another's throat. Cortes is kissing Moctezuma up there. So these forms of misrecognition, it seems like, are mediated through social norms. So to see what kind of difficulties this produces, so I want to move from Fanon to Susan Buck-Morse's account. So Susan Buck-Morse lines up the Hegelian master and slave with the European colonizer in Haiti and the Haitian enslaved population. And she says, for example, the self-liberation of the slave in Haiti is required through a trial by death, through a life and death struggle. So here we can see that the chronology simply does not fit. The trial by death precedes the establishment or the emergence of the roles of master and slave, and it precedes not only not only chronologically but also logically or dialectically, in the sense that it is a necessary condition for the latter. If there is no trial by death, you simply do not have masters and slaves, at least not in the sense of Hegel's master-slave dialectic. You can have enslaved people who are enslaved for whatever reasons, through war, whatever, but pair and connect, master and slave, from the master-slave dialectic is defined, or these roles are defined and established by how the each comes out of life and death struggle. Okay. So this, of course, it's possible to use the Hegelian master-slave dialectic in a colonial context. That's not my claim. My claim is simply that there's not such a seamless fit between the roles of master and slave and colonizer and colonized. So an appeal to an analogy between the two, to return to Zaya, doesn't really solve our original question. In fact, it seems to sharpen the question. Given these structural these difficulties in fit, how is it that he works in ultimately the master-slave dialectic into the Latin American post-colonial context? So I turn to his account now. I won't say too much about his interpretation of the master-slave dialectic. There's nothing too controversial there. He stays quite close to the text. It's difficult to say something uncontroversial about the master-slave dialectic, but he comes pretty close. He talks about how it's about independence, and one needs to show that they're not dependent on nature, on biological life. They achieve this through the recognition of the other, of their independence, and that here sociality is established, emerges for the first time. Because again, the social roles, in this case, master and slave, emerge here for the first time. Prior to that, you have natural beings who encounter one another in a state of its nature. What is different, what does stretch Hegel's account is there's broader contextualization of the master-slave dialectic. His understanding of its role in history in general. So he understands it not only as the institution of sociality, of social roles, but of society and of history. Presumably because only in a society can you have collective memory, which is a precondition for history. So history only emerges, or first emerges, with the master-slave dialectic. And the master-slave dialectic actually stretches to the end of history, or to what Hegel thought was the end of history. So say I said, the master-slave dialectic ends with the final confrontation in the French Revolution. Here, the slave finally stands up to the master, finally turns the tables, and institutes a new order. So here in the French Revolution, that says the slave takes, quote, the final step from the freedom of one, the master, to the freedom of each and every human being. So this is there's alluding here to a principle from Hegel's lectures on philosophy of history, related to the movement of spirit through history. I think it was mentioned before, where spirit moves from the idea that one is free, to the idea that some are free, to the idea that all are free. And there it's not related at all to the master-slave dialectic. They here transposes it onto the master-slave dialectic and sees all of history as moving through through the master-slave dialectic. So with this final encounter, the master-slave dialectic, relation is overcome, according to Zaya, and it's replaced by two new forms. So the bourgeois proletariat relation and the colonizer-colonized relation. So what we get is a new order. Yeah. On the one hand, the master-slave relation is cancelled. As I put it, there are no more masters, no more slaves. He who was slave previously has created a new order, an order of work rather than war. So the order of the master was based on war, on who won struggle. This one is based on work. So master-slave dialectic is cancelled but retained, and they emphasize that this is a case of Hegelian sublation or outpegging, even though it goes beyond what Hegel would say. It's retained in the sense of the lesson that is learned from the master-slave dialectic. So as they puts it here, because man had been slave, he cannot enslave without negating himself. So the thought is, we've learned that our freedom depends on the recognition of other free beings, so we can't then enslave those other free beings on pain of canceling out our own freedom, which depends on the freedom of the other. So we've learned this lesson, and it's present in the new order. It defines the primary relations of the new order. So again, these are the bourgeois proletariat relation. It's no longer a case of the master forcing a slave to work for them, but you have free contract. I work for somebody because I choose to sign a contract and to take a salary. However, there's no happy ending because this apparent freedom masks a form of domination, a new, different form of domination. So as I puts it here, the ancient slave submitted to domination to avoid being killed by he who would become his master. Now the worker submits in order to not starve to death. So actually, I can't really choose to not sell my labor because I starve to death. So here we've obviously left Hegel behind and moved on to Marx. So we have the familiar Marxian picture, although Marx doesn't make the connection to the master-slave dialectic, the picture of how domination is concealed under an appearance of freedom is a familiar one. However, it's not so familiar, it's not so clear how these lessons fit into the colonial order. So there doesn't seem to be a pretense of freedom. It seems like a group of colonizers come and simply subjugate the local population without pretending that this sort of subjugation is free or without any role for freedom, even a pretend one. So the question is, how does the master-slave dialectic, how is it retained in this other relation, in this colonizer-colonized relation that replaces the master-slave relation? So they insist that it is indeed retained. So he puts it here, quote, the ancient slave, so repeating the point that he made with respect to the bourgeois proletarian relation, here also, the ancient slave cannot dominate his fellow human beings. So the colonizer who arrives in the world is the ancient slave, it's the former slave, not the master, it's the former slave. So continuing the quotation, quote, for this reason, if he is to impose new forms of slavery, these must be underpinned by the idea that the beings he has encountered in his colonial expansion are not fellow human beings. So in a way, you have the opposite of the bourgeois proletarian relation, where we pretend that the relation is a free one. Here you pretend that the object of the relation is not a human being, that it's not a relation to a free human being. So as Zaya says, this determines how the European colonizers view the indigenous population in Latin America. So they cannot see them as free beings. Rather, quote, the most that can be accepted is their possibility of becoming human, a possibility that depends on the efforts of the colonizer to make them conscious of their humanity. So the view of the European colonizer, according to Zaya, is that what they find, or what they think they find, are sort of semi-natural beings, but beings who nonetheless have the potential to be human. So they're not subjecting free. They're not subjugating other free beings. They're not allowed to do that. But you are now allowed to subjugate nature, right, in this new order. So they take themselves to be subjugating sort of semi-natural beings. So this leads to a very specific form of the colonizer-colonized relation in Latin America, and it's the encomienda relation. So the encomienda relation, it's an economic relation on the one level. So I'm just going to summarize what a historian said about this. So the encomienda relation is one in which towns, villages, and other populated places are commended into the charge of persons or corporations who have the right to collect stipulated dues and services from the inhabitants. So the thought is a group of an indigenous population is sort of commended or entrusted into the charge of some local bigwig, and they have to pay taxes to that person, but because they don't have money or gold, they work for them. Now they pay them with labor. So it's this kind of strange kind of relation that develops in Latin America, in Spanish Latin America. However, something that I emphasize, it's also a moral relation. So this is something that was clear from or implicit in the previous things that he stated. So the encomendados, the people who are commended, are entrusted or commended to the European, who, according to Zaya, quote, is like the father who is supposed to lead them along the best path towards the achievement of their humanity and freedom. So the thought is you have potential humans, perhaps maybe like children. So the role of the European then is to allow them to work for you in order to learn how to be real, free, independent humans. So help them along this development. And the encomienda was the locus of this kind of relation. So we see how this is embedded in the okay. So conclusion. So the master-slave dialectic for Zaya does not represent the colonizer-colonized relation. So I think he does not simply try to identify the master with the colonizer, the European colonizer, and the slave, which is colonized in any direct or straightforward way. Rather, the colonizer is the former slave who has passed through and learned the lesson of the master-slave dialectic, a different kind of figure who brings a different kind of order and establishes a different kind of relation. The lesson learned by the former slave from the master-slave dialectic leads to a new form of recognition, a way of relating to others, and a new social relation, the encomendero relation. So it's the master-slave dialectic or relation qua sublated that determines sort of the colonial order and the new social forms that arise in the colonial order. So, so I said there was some consensus in the literature that master and slave represent colonized and colonized. I think that's not quite right. I think the master-slave relation, however, is important. And the reason that Zaya draws on it is because it ultimately determines, not directly, but qua sublated, the new social forms that arise, the forms of recognition and misrecognition that arise in a Latin American colonial context. So he's doing something very different, something quite interesting. So he's not trying to sort of superimpose the master-slave relation onto the colonial situation. I think he sees that the conditions are not there for that. The conditions are different. Rather, he's using the master-slave dialectic to explain why these conditions are what they are, why these conditions are in place, and why they generate certain kinds of specific kinds of misrecognition, social forms, swayed in social order and social relations that they do. So I think a lot of times the master-slave dialectic is contrasted with the colonial situation. I think this is what wants to do. He wants to show it's different here in Martinique. We won't have this kind of dialectical development like you get with the master-slave dialectic. So they're doing something different. He's using the master-slave dialectic not to contrast, but to explain the conditions that we get. Okay, so thank you very much for your attention. I look forward to the Q&A.
Thanks, Pavel, for a fascinating talk. We have 15 minutes for questions and discussion. Okay, first is from.
Should I go?
Yes, yeah.
Pavel, for interesting. So I was wondering, you may be very curious, you at least about SIA, and I really could say something about the extent to which SIA also was interested in the relations of recognition or misrecognition in the post-colonial situation in Latin America. I mean, Elvira talked about the way Du Bois looked at analogous issue in the case of the US, right? And I mean, also in the case of Latin America, for example, the role of indigenous people and in the areas that had slavery, the former slaves and their descendants. So it's not something that let's say also is interested in and uses recognition theoretic approaches to analyze or
Yeah, certainly. So the second part of his work that I was talking about takes up the situation post-liberation, after the liberation. It was supposed to be the third part of my talk today. It was supposed to deal with that section, but I had to cut it out completely. And there is a very interesting dialectic there. So you have various forms of one-sided recognition between the people who come to occupy the power vacuum left by the Europeans. And it, in a way, it also mirrors the kind of master-slave dialectic. So first you get the conservative who tries to simply retain the old order, but only with themselves in charge. So they kind of ignore the people lower down in the caste system, the criollos. So they formulates this in terms of very much in terms of the caste system that you had at the time. And then their sort of project, their freedom project is negated by the liberal, and they come from the class of the criollos, or the mestizos and or the lower rungs of the class order, and they want to simply eliminate and start from scratch. So they want to eliminate anything that has to do with the old world and start from zero. Hence, their model is the U.S. At the time, as the land of freedom and business, ultimately commerce. So you have one group that looks to the old world, one group that looks to the new world, which is the U.S. And they each kind of misrecognize each other in various interesting ways. He hints that there is a kind of final salvation, but I think he thinks it hasn't happened yet. So kind of let's start with this unresolved dialectic between these two parts. Yeah, does that answer?
But we also mestizos then.
So you had
In the picture.
so the conservatives are often from the criollo class, actually. Did I say so the system was peninsulares at the top, Spaniards born in Spain. Below that you had criollos, sons or descendants of Spaniards born in Latin America. They were often wealthy landowners, they were the owners of the hacienda. Bolivar was one of these people who was super well connected, super wealthy. And then you had mestizos and indigenous and the Black African slave population. And it wasn't clear how they would fit into the liberation project. Was Bolivar just trying to, establish a new order led by the criollos, or was it the more egalitarian one? And that's kind of the way the dialectic breaks out. And then the liberals, the future liberals, are from the mestizo indigenous classes.
Great, thank you. Next question from Max Ziller.
Thank you very much for the presentation. You mentioned a certain puzzlement that I would share about the focus on the master-slave dialectic in taking up Hegel's phenomenology. It's not such a puzzle, though, if you remember that through Alexandre Kojève's reading of Hegel in the 30s, highly influential in France and in the entire Latin-speaking or Romance language-speaking world, this might have happened. And he is also the one who uses the translation of Hegel's terms as maître et esclave rather than seigneur et valet, as he might have said. The Hegel terms are Herr und Knecht. So both are not what is usually the English translation. It's not master, but lord. And it's not slave, but knave or vessel, feudal underling, a very specific historical situation that isn't the early modern situation of enslavement, but the medieval situation of a feudal social order. How important is that? And are we simply to gloss over that, or are we to make something out of that?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, it's a good question. So so Kojève is an obvious connection, and yeah, it is. As I mentioned, his lectures on Hegel were translated into Spanish in 1971. So 7 years before, wrote this book, he probably would have been familiar with Kojève anyway, independently or previously to that translation. There are a lot of similarities, yeah, with Kojève. But I kind of just wanted to leave Kojève out of the story and explain it independently of Kojève. But it does relate to the point of the translation. So I said master slave to translate them because I'm translating Zayas' translation of it. He uses amo and esclavo usually to talk about Herr und Knecht. So he uses the word esclavo, slave, most often. Though there is an interesting movement that he makes. So he usually uses the word amo and esclavo, master and slave, but sometimes he switches into what does he say? Señor and siervo, I think, something like that. So there it implies more and connect. It implies more the feudal lord and the feudal subject, the bondsman. So I think he doesn't say it explicitly, but the fact that he uses both of these Spanish terms to translate Herr and Knecht makes me think that he thinks there's a development of this relation in the Middle Ages, that it slightly changes. not something he emphasizes. I'm just drawing this solely from the terms that he uses. It is a bit mysterious, though.
Thank you.
Thank you. I have 3 questions on the list. Next is Geza.
Thanks, Pavel, for this wonderful talk. I really enjoyed it. Since it's the last hours of our conference, I just pick up on the discussion yesterday and also today. So this question, you remember this image of the puzzle?
Yeah.
So can we just take one piece of the puzzle and then use it? And I thought, because you showed very nicely that they are only draws on this master slave dialectic without taking into account the whole philosophy of Hegel. So do you think we have to so do we have to buy the whole thing? Do we have to take all the metaphysics with it, or what would it mean to take only this little piece for our methodology?
Yeah, it's a question that I've been thinking about since yesterday. I haven't really come up with a good solution, but it does fit in with this definitely. So Zayas' appropriation of Hegel is a very sort of violent one. He doesn't really care about the textual niceties. It's not really an interpretation. Although he does want to be faithful to the text in a lot of ways, but it's a sort of creative appropriation for his own purposes. Maybe like with Fichte in your group there in Argentina. Maybe a more violent one, because on the one hand he gives a sort of textually close reading of the mass slave dialectic, but then he does something completely different with it. So can you do that? Yeah. I mean, so I think this perhaps is the proverbial case of thinking with Hegel against Hegel on this specific issue for Latin America in world history, its relation to universal European history. I think in a way the starting point comes from Hegel. So this is also from what Luis mentioned. So the idea that Latin America is outside of history was a motivating factor in a lot of philosophical production in the 20th century. Husserl himself says that by reading Zaya, he learned that he was outside of history, and that his whole philosophical purpose has been to make possible the entry of Latin America into history. So the problem, setting of the problem, comes from Hegel, and then certain elements, come from Hegel, the master slave dialectic. I think Zaya would say that Hegel's is kind of an accurate representation of European history, and I do kind of worry about that. But so I think he would say, yeah, that's how European history actually developed. Hegel and then Marx gave us an accurate representation, so we have to draw on them because they're the paradigm about accurate accounts. But I do worry about that. I think he looks at history, European history, too much through Hegel. But yeah. Yeah, I don't know. Those are my thoughts. So, what do you think about?
Yeah, I'm myself very unsure. And especially like afraid of, we have to buy in somehow the whole picture, like the whole metaphysics, and what do we do with this? Is it in any sense contemporary, or can we work with this? Oh, yeah, but of course these are the open questions. I think it kind of depends on your purpose. What are you looking for when you're reading this metaphysics? One has to buy into the whole metaphysics if one wants to produce some scholarly interpretation, and that's perfect. And I think we all work in that way. But we can also have other purposes and other aims when dealing with these authors. And I think the important thing is to recognize that we are reading with different aims and different purposes, and we are not always just being scholarly interpretation producers. And we want to think for ourselves. And when we do that, then the relationship with the source must change. Yeah,
they're very happily dismisses whole parts of Hegel. He just said, "Oh, this Hegel exists, but that's nonsense." Without any problem, I don't have any problem with him doing that. I don't know.
Let me take the last 2 questions. So to be strict, we'll take the next one from Christopher.
Thanks, Pavel. In the book, The Role of the Americas in History, Sea seems to think that once you move on to whatever comes after the master and slave dialectic, this new form of recognition, what he calls social Darwinism at times. Other times he calls it social positivism. But in essence, it just means the domination of non-white male bodies seems to play a pretty essential role in these new processes of recognition. And I was just wondering, how does that fit in the stories? Maybe it's somehow linked to the casta system and the encomienda system in this other writings that you're looking at, or how does that work?
Yeah, so I think so. The caste system that we discussed, as you know, is very racial. It's a division of economic role, but on the basis of race. Or the two, race and the economic role, correspond completely. And I don't know if Zaya would. So somebody like Anibal Quijano makes his claim. He says that's the birth of racism, actually, as we know today, that Latin American caste system, because you get economic functions that correspond precisely to race. Maybe he would think something like that. I don't know. He talks about race much less than one would expect, and about indigenous people. He doesn't mention, in this work, he also mentions Darwinism as a kind of justificatory thesis. But he doesn't connect it to race. And yeah, I haven't read this book that you mentioned. What year, or is it one of the later ones?
I am not sure, actually. The role of the Americas in history, yeah. Maybe yes and no, I don't.
Yeah, I think race is implicit in this, especially after in the post-liberation situation. But here, for example, he explains the encomienda relation, or that relation of dependence, not through racism or some kind of hierarchical view of races, but simply for historical reasons, how the master slave dialectic ended up. It's kind of that racism that you see there is the result of just how history developed through the master slave dialectic. So, yeah. Those are my thoughts on that.
Great, thanks. But the last question for this session is about.
It was already answered, but it's fine.
Already answered?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, we are just about out of time. So let's thank our speaker, Pavel.